Hi everyone, good morning if you're in Queensland, and hello wherever you are around the world. We've got a really great attendance here for this broadcast, and it's obviously a great topic of interest for a lot of people, this whole concept of moving from performance appraisal to performance conversation, or should I say performance development. And I don't think the two things are the same. Appraising and development are two different concepts. So we're going to talk about those in the next hour. The normal process is that if you've got questions or even comments, please type them in when you think about them through the presentation. I'll be throwing a lot at you during this hour, and I think that there'll be a lot of questions and comments and observations that people might want to make, because we've all been in this situation of performance reviews and appraisals. So when you think of something, please, I'd suggest you type it in so that by the time we finish at the end, we'll have a whole lot of comments and questions that I could address, and I'll finish a little bit earlier as a result of that. But just in the interest of continuity, I'll keep it going for 45 minutes, about with 15 minutes or 10 minutes. So I'll just turn off the web. I'm not distracted. Okay, so let's get underway. Yes, there's three things that I'm hoping of this presentation, which goes for an hour, as you'd be aware. I guess the first thing is to understand why performance reviews are outdated and ineffective. I dare say some of you who are in this broadcast are probably great supporters of the performance review, and that's fine. I just want to share with you my view and some of the research that I've done in this area, and perhaps get you to critically reflect on your performance reviews. But certainly I have a bias towards thinking that they don't work. I've written a book in that regard, and I've put together a process to replace it with. Secondly, I want to look at some strategies to be able to get you or your organisation to shift from appraising people to developing people. To me, it's the development that's the critically important part that's often missing. And, during performance appraisal, many of you may say, well, there's opportunities to develop as well as appraise. I'm not sure about that. There's a fair bit to do in that event, which I call an event, for you to do or for your managers to do. And it's very hard to be able to do both appraisal and development. And thirdly, I'd like to familiarise yourselves, if you haven't already been familiar with, the 5 Conversations framework, which is a framework that's taking off big time all over the world. There are lots of organisations, private sector, public sector, not-for-profit, who are taking this on board across all cultures. And some of them are using it as an appraisal, some of them are using it to replace their performance review, and others are using it as an enabler to ensure that the performance review actually is more effective. So we're getting both sorts of responses to it. Okay, so these are 3 things that we will cover during this presentation. Now you can see all of the different companies. They're all well-known companies on the screen, and you could probably guess they've all got in common is the fact that they're all getting rid of their performance reviews and replacing it with some sort of a performance discussion framework. I wish they were all taking on the 5 Conversations, but they're not. But they're taking on different strategies, and so this all occurred in the last couple of years. So there's been a real change over the last couple of years. So really it does beg the question, why? And what's the thinking behind these companies? What have they done to ensure that, or to perhaps look at other ways and means of doing things? So let's have a look at some of those reasons and rationale and what they're actually thinking on those companies and what they're doing. GE, which we're all familiar with, and a lot of case studies, useful case studies in leadership in particular. They've decided, or they've announced, that they're going to abolish their what they call their rank and yank system, which assigns employees a performance score relative to their peers. So they're getting rid of the whole concept of scoring. I personally am not a big believer in giving people ratings for a couple of reasons, but the obvious reason is that it's not any more objective than to give feedback. Because if you're giving people ratings, you're doing it on a perception anyway. And sometimes by giving people a rating, what's happening is that you're not actually giving them the feedback that they should be getting. They need to improve in this area, or you're very happy with what they're doing over here. So the rankings sometimes are a bit of a cop-out. And the other thing about rankings, of course, is that people will tend to rank people in the middle. I hear this all the time. They don't want to offend the person, and by the same token, they don't want to give them too good a ranking, otherwise they might slacken off. So there's a lot of problems with rankings, and obviously GE has understood this and has decided that to get rid of those. One example. If you look at another global organisation with over 300,000 employees, they're undergoing what their CEO considers to be a massive revolution, where they're really talking about timely, personalised employee feedback, replacing the annual evaluations and rankings. So they've decided to get rid of the performance review, and they're looking at an ongoing dialogue between their managers and their team members. And I think that's a very positive move in the right direction. Early days, but I'm sure we'll get some feedback about how that's going. So there's another example a large company is doing. Microsoft, which we all know, probably use their products. Most of us use their products on a regular basis. So Microsoft have overhauled their own performance management process, and they're moving also towards a conversation model as well. And so it'll be interesting to see how they operate. And certainly on a lesser scale, I've found that lots of SMEs, particularly in Australia, are getting rid of their performance reviews and having performance conversations. Some of them didn't even have performance reviews in place, so they've actually gone straight from having nothing to performance conversations, which is So Laszlo Bock, who's the human resources manager at Google, had this to say recently. Performance management as practiced by most organisations has become a rule-based bureaucratic process existing as an end in itself rather than actually shaping performance. Employees hate it, managers hate it, even HR departments hate it. That's been my experience as well. I occasionally come across people that say that they really enjoy performance reviews, but they certainly are in the minority. And so I think the sentiments expressed here are probably reflective of what's going on in organisations. So I guess the question is why are they unpopular, and what can we do about it? I think the first thing I'd say is that I've tried to find research that demonstrates conclusively that performance reviews actually enhance performance. And I have yet to come across any evidence whatsoever, empirical evidence, that performance reviews themselves increase performance. So it sort of begs the question, why are we doing it if it's not actually increasing performance? Here's something I'd like you to think about, and these are my words, and I'd just like you to have a think about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but have a think. If we want employees, that is, our employees working together, which I think is fair to say we do, and not competing with one another, towards an achieved common goal, removing ratings is a good starting point. So in other words, by setting up a rating system, what we're actually doing is we're creating a competitive environment. And many of you may argue that a competitive environment is just part of what business is about. But then it's no good, on the other hand, then saying we want everyone to work towards a common goal and we want everyone to work as a team member. That sends a very confusing signal to people. So I just want you to have a think and ponder that for a moment, because if we're trying to develop teamwork in organisations, then things that are going to mitigate against teamwork, such as ratings, are obviously getting in the way. So there's perhaps another reason why we might consider that. People will often say to me, well, if we don't rate people, we won't know where they are in terms of their performance. Well, I totally disagree with that. I think I could probably walk into any of your organisations and sit down and just observe people for 20 minutes, and I will know instantly, well, at least within 20 minutes, I will know who your top performers are. And my perceptions will probably be no different to yours. So in other words, it's not a great mystery. What is the problem is, of course, that people aren't talking to each other, giving feedback, talking about strengths and talents, talking about opportunities for growth. So what happens is, of course, we decide to revert to this numeric system, which saves us from actually being frank and honest and open with people, which is a real shame. I often use the analogy, if I was going to the gym today, and I'm not, probably should, but if I was going to the gym today and I had a choice of two trainers, one trainer was going to give me a rating out of 5 on the basis of my workout, and the other one was going to give me feedback all the way through the workout. I prefer the latter, as I'm sure you would, because I'm getting that ongoing constant dialogue. I know where I stand with that trainer, whereas with the other one, as I walk out the door and I'm given a 4 out of 5, I'm thinking to myself, why the 4? What have I done? Now, why am I not a 5? And thank goodness I'm not a 3. So those questions linger with me, and I might talk to one of my fellow gym members and say, what rating did you get? And they say a 3. I say, oh, why? And they say, well, I don't really know. So, okay. So I spoke to 9,000 HR managers, and it was a very simple little bit of research, but nevertheless it was very powerful. I simply asked them to indicate to me if there was one thing that was wrong with their current or traditional performance appraisal, what was it? So I was really just trying to get a handle on what people were concerned about in their current system. So I then listened to what those comments were, and then I put some themes around them, and these are the 8 themes. Recognise them, I'm sure. One of the themes that came is that they're a costly exercise. These aren't necessarily, by the way, but one of the themes was that they cost a lot of money. Appraisals cost money. If you actually think about it, you spend an hour appraising someone's performance. Let's say you might do that twice a year because that's been the trend over the last 5 or so years. There's 2 hours per person. Let's say there's an hour of preparation involved. There's now 4 hours per person. And also, let's also understand that while we're preparing or completing our review, we're actually not doing anything else. You know, we're not actually involved in anything else. So that's an opportunity cost that has to be associated with the appraisal. So we have to really double that to 8 hours. So that really means that we're actually investing 8 hours per year, which doesn't sound like much, but multiply that by the number of people in an organisation, and there's a significant cost associated with the appraisal. Now that in itself is not a problem, but the question then becomes, are we getting value for money for investing that 8 hours per person per year? And if we're not, then the question then is, why are we doing it? So the concerns. Another concern that people had around the review is that the word meaning can happens talking to a couple of HR managers is that their work often starts around appraisal time, in the sense that they are often putting out fires and sorting out issues because managers aren't approaching the appraisal correctly, or an employee thinks that they're being bullied, or there's all sorts of things going on that aren't necessarily the case, and it creates a whole lot of work and hassle for HR personnel during this time. A third theme came up in the research was that appraisals are often a monologue rather than dialogue. In other words, the person that's doing all the talking is often the manager. So what actually happens is that the employee is just passively sitting there, or the team member's just passively sitting there. The manager ends up doing. Of course, is problematic, isn't it? Because it means that it's not really a dialogue, it's not really a conversation, and that's because, pretty simply, because the manager's got all the paperwork, they're the one making the judgments often, and it's not a really even conversation, so that's a real issue. Okay, okay, let's move on. I just got a bit of feedback saying the audio isn't all that great. I apologise for that. I'll make a few adjustments here. I'm not sure I can do much about it at this stage, but I'll see what I can do. Right, the next particular theme that came up in the research was that there was a degree of formality around the appraisal, and that stifles discussion. Often managers were telling me, or human resources managers were telling me, that these appraisals were done in the boss's office, or are done, and usually behind a desk. And as a result of that, it becomes quite a stifling sort of atmosphere, and it creates a lack of conversation. And so that is, I'm sure people are familiar with it. It's often a stressful enough situation as it is, but having it in a boss's office is not necessarily conducive to getting a conversation actually occurring. Appraisals are too infrequent, and this one was a very popular theme, and I think that's very true. I mean, once a year, a year in this day and age in 2016 is an eternity. There's so much that can happen in 12 months, and to just sit down and appraise somebody every 12 months is quite unrealistic, and it becomes a problem. And what people have done is now decided to do it twice a year, so it just creates twice the burden, but 6 months again is quite a long time. So that creates a problem, and it's an issue there for managers following up. Another theme, and I'm sure this one wouldn't surprise you, that came up is that appraisals are an exercise in form filling. So what's actually happening is that we have a situation where people are filling out forms, and I've actually had feedback where people have actually said to me that they couldn't make eye contact once during the appraisal discussion, to put it loosely, discussion, because they were too busy filling out the forms. And of course, I know a lot of you have tried to simplify the forms for that very reason, but nevertheless, it's being perceived as a bureaucratic exercise, a box-ticking exercise, an exercise of filling out paperwork than anything else, and it doesn't actually show on HR as a profession either. Big thing that came through is that they're very rarely followed up, and I think that's very true. I mean, once it's done, it's so stressful. What we often do then is we just file them away electronically. Excuse Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. I'll just have another drink. Oh. Yeah. So we file them away, and often what happens is we don't see them again for another 12 months, and that can be a real problem. So that, I'm sure you'd accept that that's, well, it's nothing, nothing actually gets done between and finally, most people find the appraisal stressful. In other words, managers don't like it, employees don't like it, HR don't like it, so everyone finds it stressful. I don't think being stressful is a problem, quite frankly. I think that there's lots of things in life that are stressful, but the question is unnecessary stress, of course, is not necessary. So there you are. There's what I found talking to HR people. So there's for 3 camps that are in process. I think there's a group of people that performance reviews are not working. We need to improve them. Belong to that camp. People that have a think where you fall into this category. We have another group of people who think that performance reviews are fine. It's the manager conducting them that's the problem. In other words, if we give them training, teach them some interpersonal skills and whatever, make things a lot easier. And there's another camp, another group of people who think that performance reviews just improve the process. So if we tinkered with the paperwork, or we, different format, or got out of the offices, or whatever, group of people there. So you might like to think, where are you in that groupings, in those 3 groupings? I'm not here to try and convince you that reviews aren't working, although I think it would probably be my contention that they're not working, but to improve them, I think what I would be doing is looking at what happens between the reviews rather than what they like themselves. I think one of our big problems, it's kind of like the elephant in the room in some respects, is the thing that's the problem in all of this, I think, is the adjustment from the command and control mindset to the adaptive leadership mindset. So they're still operating out of this paradigm that they are the boss, they know best, they're in control, they have more rights than the individual. I think this is really quite true, even though we sometimes think our people have moved on, or we at least like to think that's the case. I think there is kind of just don't understand what their leadership role is. Now, obviously, if that's the case, they're going to think that the performance review should be done in a certain way, and that is, it's more about appraisal and development. But I think it's fair to say that adaptive leadership is actually really of the day, isn't it? I mean, all of these things around problem development, these things are really what good leadership is about in 2016. I think the problem with the performance review is it kind of almost reinforces this command and control mindset. So I think a lot of the problems here are really around what leaders think about themselves as leaders, but that's probably another in its own right, so we can talk about that at another time. One of my books that I co-authored with Aubrey Warren, we said that organisations are conversations. Basically what we mean by that is that if you think about it, an organisation is just a collection of people who are all working towards a common cause, or that's what should happen. And at the end of the day, there's a whole series of conversations going on every day. Some of them are going on in the boardroom, some of them in the lunchroom, some of them in the hallway, others in people's offices. Sometimes they're impromptu, sometimes they're organised, sometimes they're done in the field, sometimes in the toilet. It goes on and on and on, but organisations are just a series of conversations. So the question really then is, how do we make sure that the conversations that people are having in organisations are productive? Now, I would suggest there are two types of conversations broadly in organisations. There's project or work-specific or task-specific conversations. I don't think there's any issues there necessarily. I think people are quite comfortable about talking about the work that needs doing. But there's a whole other raft of conversations that are not going on, which are the people development conversations. And these are the conversations that people are missing. In fact, someone said to me the other day, we just don't have time for conversations, which, you know, is kind of humorous in a way. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we've got too much work to do to be having conversations. In other words, the assumption was that conversations are just standing around or sitting around talking about nothing, whereas conversations, of course, in my thinking, are a lot more than that. Of course, they're quite productive. So there's a lot of perceptions out there that about conversations and so forth. And a lot of people say we don't have the skills and we need to do some training to have conversations. I just think that's quite amusing in a way. I'm not suggesting that training's not important, but imagine if your parents were alive today and you went and you saw you were going to have a chat to your parents or dad. We're having training in our workplace for conversations. I think we're quite amused. A long way, haven't we, from where we were 10 or 15 years ago, I think, and obviously technology has taken over a lot of this. We've just got to be careful that we don't move too far and forget that at the end of the day, it's just about human beings. And one of my future book titles is called Bringing the Human Being Back to Work Through Conversation, because I just think it's really critical. And I don't mean in a soppy way, I just mean we need to be connecting with people in a real way. Okay, there's a few myths around the performance review that I'd like to discuss with you before we move on to looking at some of the solutions to what I'm advocating here. These myths are on the latest book that's coming out in December, Performance Management for Agile Organizations. That come up about performance reviews is that they increase individual. If you increase individual performance, you'll increase organisational performance. Now that's not necessarily true. In other words, a rising tide floats all boats. This is not necessarily true. Just because everyone is performing at an optimal level doesn't necessarily mean the organisation is performing at an optimal level. Have a think about it. Systems thinking. It's the interdependencies between people, it's the systems, it's the way people connect and work with each other that's often lost in all this. So the performance review has this assumption that all we have to do is try and increase individuals' performance, and that's all that's needed. Well, that's not necessarily true. Just a simple example of that. Somebody's done all their background checks for a report, but they're not getting additional information from another department that they need. That's a problem. In other words, that person's not able to do their job even though they're performing at a high level because they're being impeded by somebody else not contributing. So you can see that the myth of performance reviews is a myth. You need performance reviews to objectively categorise people. As I said before, I mean, at the end of the day, scores that we give people are essentially just perceptions anyway, and often those perceptions aren't not necessarily true or correct. So the whole notion that the review actually makes our scores official and makes it very objective is absolute nonsense. There are a lot of people that will snigger about the scores that they get in reviews and, suggest that they've been hard done managers gone easy on them. Myth. Another myth, of course, is that managers are in the best position to make judgments about people's performance. Not necessarily true. And of course, a lot of you have decided to involve your team members in the ratings process as well, which I think is a positive move in the right direction. But at the end of the day, the performance review is still heavily weighted towards management judgment. So, and who's to say that the manager's correct in their appraisal of the employee? Often they're not. They're blindsided by a whole range of other factors. Another myth is that performance reviews enhance employee performance. Well, I've never seen any evidence of that, and I just don't think it works. I just actually giving people a rating, even explaining why the rating is such, does not actually increase performance. So why do we do it? It doesn't really increase performance. It's another myth. Another myth is that performance reviews are designed to help employees. Actually, they're designed to help managers. So that we've got a legally defensible document that if anything goes wrong, we can throw the book at someone and say, look, you've had feedback, you're not performing, there's the door. So I don't think performance reviews are designed for employees at all. They're a management tool that has been designed by management for management. And that's why employees are pretty much disengaged when it comes to performance reviews. There's 5 myths. And, you might like to just have a think about those myths and how they, how they might go and inform your own opinion about the reviews. Now, I made a provocative statement here that I think about, and at first glance it looks quite provocative, but I think it's fair to say that I'll demonstrate it. I'd argue that the roles that people play in organisations are more important than the jobs they do. So have a think about that for a moment. It's not so much the jobs only that people do, the roles that they play are more important. So let me just tease that out for you a little bit so you can understand that provocative statement. This work comes from my book at the end of the performance review. Let's have a look at the work that people do. Now, the work that people do can be divided into 2 categories. There is a job role that people are expected to perform, and the job role is essentially based on a whole bunch of technical skills. Now, that's normally captured in a job description. Now, that influence performance. There's a whole raft of non-job roles, or what I call non-job roles, that actually have a huge impact on performance that are often ignored in the job description. Let's look at 4 that I think are important. There's a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. I wouldn't expect anybody to come to work bouncing off the walls with positivity. That's nice if they are. It can be a bit off-putting as well. But I don't expect people to come to work being negative, undermining, backbiting, pointing the finger of blame, and so forth. That to me is not on. So when I say a positive mental attitude and enthusiasm, I expect people to be easy to work with and constructive. Another non-job role that we expect people to perform is a team role. And what I mean by that essentially is that we're expecting people to operate and work in a team. But I quite often hear people say, look, I'm good at my job. I don't like working in a team. I'm not a team player. It's not written on my job description and so forth. Well, in fact, it should be. And people are expected to be able to operate and perform in a team environment. I don't think any of you disagree with me on that. It's not something that's highlighted it's usually a bullet point towards the end of the work document, not usually in the front and center. Another role that we want people to play in the workplace is a career role, and by a career role I mean that the person is continually upskilling and updating their qualifications and their particular skill, their skill set. And often you hear people say, well, you know, I'm too old to learn, or I've been using this system, I'm not really interested in doing anything else. That's a problem, not just for the person themselves, but it's also a problem for the organisation, because that person ultimately will become a liability as the world moves at warp speed. A non-job role that I think is critically important is innovation and continuous improvement. We actually want people to bring their brains to work and come up with ways and means of making the workplace a better workplace. So, and I don't think that's unreasonable either, but again, it's like pulling teeth often. And I think the reason that's pulling teeth, those four things on the right-hand side, is because they're often they're not elevated in terms of the work document. So I would argue that people actually have 5 roles to play in the workplace. They have a job role and 4 non-job roles. Now, if you conceptualise your work that way, you're guaranteed to broaden your definition of performance beyond the job, and you'll undoubtedly get better performance. But if we don't start talking about the things that are on the right-hand side, what will happen is that they're not considered to be as important as the things on the left-hand side. But you would have to acknowledge that things on the right-hand side are critically important to performance. Absolutely, I'm sure you'd agree. So one of these things are often, again, not talked about in the performance review. It's really the things that are talked about on the job description. So we're missing a whole raft of very important performance-specific work that ought to be done in the formal setting. Now, just to underline my point about that, this is a survey done of 9,000, I think it was actually more than that, 10,000 managers across several continents who were simply asked the question that what do you value most in terms of attributes that your employees have? What are the most important attributes? And what's really interesting about this, I'm not going to go through it all, it's very busy, but what's really interesting about these top 10, and these were the frequency, this is what came up. What's really interesting about these top 10 is there's nothing in there that's on the left-hand side of the model I just shared with you. They are all non-job roles. So isn't it interesting? That doesn't mean that we don't want technically proficient people, of course, we do. But isn't it interesting when we ask leaders what they want from people, they actually are now talking about the non-job roles that people play. So I'm just trying to underline how critically important those things are and why we need to have a broader dimension of performance that goes beyond just the job focus. Talk about one of the solutions. This is the 5 conversations framework, and some of you would have seen this before. Framework works like this. We have 5 10-minute conversations once a month with each of our direct reports. Now, people are often sceptical and say, surely they couldn't be only 10 minutes. And anyway, what's 10 minutes? That's not likely to be able to do much good. A 10-minute focused conversation is better than a 2-hour meandering conversation any day of the week. And we give people the questions so that they can complete them. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we've got the topics. So the topics are climate review. Now, climate review really refers to people's job satisfaction and their morale and their communication. And so the first question really is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? And the team member might say, 6. And then the manager then follows that up with why. And the conversations around trying to help people be more engaged in the work that they do. Organisations spend, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars on climate surveys that they do online once a year. You can actually complete all of that in a conversation in 10 minutes, asking the right questions across the organisation, and record that. And there's a system that accompanies this process. Two, we start talking about people's strengths and talents. And, you know, the years of literature utilising people's strengths and talents. I totally agree. And so why don't we start having conversations about what people are not good at, and we create an upward spiral of positivity. So that's conversation 2 in month 2. And then we move on to conversation 3, which is opportunities for growth. And these conversations are really around what people can do to improve, because obviously we've all got things we've got to work on, so that doesn't get left off the list. Probably the most difficult of the 5 conversations, but nevertheless, it clearly has to be done. Now, you can probably imagine that after you've done a strengths and talents conversation and opportunities for growth conversation, and by the way, there are heaps of tools out there that are really powerful to be able to glean people's strengths. You've got the team management profile, you've got, other systems that you can use that are really great to really hone in on what people are actually good at, innately talented at. So there's plenty of support material out there. Opportunities for growth is always 1 or 2 things, and we usually confine 1 thing to the conversation in month 3 to be discussed. Month 4, after you've talked about strengths and opportunities, it's likely that there'll be a whole lot of learning and development needs that have to be discussed to capitalise on the strengths and to overcome the opportunities, or to build on, to work on the opportunities for growth. Learning and development doesn't necessarily mean sending someone off to a course. It could well be just to coach them, or to explain something to people, or clarify something, or, there's a lot of different ways and means that we can learn in the organisation. Perspective, training needs analysis done right there in a conversation. Where's your succession planning? Right here in month 2. So you can see that you can hang a whole lot of your HR interventions off the 5 conversations framework. And month 5, we have an innovation and continuous improvement conversation, which is really about ways and means of improving the efficiency and effectiveness of an organisation. So month 4 is about what people can do to improve themselves, and month 5 is what people can do to improve the work setting that they're in. It's really exciting to think that, just pick a round figure of 100 people in an organisation, it's really exciting to think that those 100 people in an SME during the month of, say, November, are having a conversation around innovation and continuous improvement. It's very likely that there's going to be some really positive, cost-effective and easy to implement solutions that come out of that conversation, or that series of conversations. Not all of them will be practical, but some of them will, and once they become implemented, people will start to be a little bit more forthcoming in the ways and means of improving their working area. So there's a whole lot of opportunities there as well. So that's the 5 conversations framework. And as I said, I think the idea is to have 2 rounds of this a year. So you can imagine what this would do for the culture of the organisation you work with or in. Imagine if every single leader was having 5 or having 10 10-minute conversations a year with their team members on their own development. You would have to expect some significant changes in culture. So it's a culture change process as much as it is anything. An online system that is used to administer this process. I think there are two reasons why the 5 conversations won't work. One of them is have some sort of a rationale or training for the actual managers themselves. They need to understand what the 5 conversations are, why we're doing it, how to implement it, and all the rest. So that's critically important. But the other aspect, of course, is to have some sort of system of tracking. You can certainly do this in a manual format, but it just creates more paperwork. So I've designed an online system, which I'm more than happy to demonstrate to you, not now, but this is just a screenshot, but I'm more than happy to demonstrate this to any of you if you're interested in having a look at how the system works. Just send me an email and I'm more than happy online to show you how the whole thing works. So there's a system that works really, really well. So what I might do, just because we're just coming towards the end now, if you've got any questions, any comments, see if you can type them in now, because I will respond to them very shortly. A couple of quick things while you're doing that are important that you might like to consider. I have designed a one-day workshop based on a book I mentioned earlier called Conversations at Work, and this book, this workshop goes for a day, which gives a chance to develop their conversation skills, and this is really targeted, of course, at managers and leaders. So if you're interested in me running this as an in-house, let me know, because we can do that. Conversations is covered in this process, and the whole program is designed to develop confidence and skill in these developmental conversations. Second thing is, if you send me an email, I'm more than happy to give you a 20% discount, and I'll sign the books for you as well. 20% discount on these two books if you haven't already got a copy of my book, The End of the Performance Review, which essentially covers the 5 conversations in more detail. Send me an email. I'll send you out a book with a coupon. I'll send you a coupon out. You can purchase this on my website with a 20% discount, or the Conversations at Work book, which of course is really a broader look at developmental conversations in the world of work and how to create a culture of conversations. So there's a couple of things that you might like to think about. Okay, let's get on with the questions. Let's see what we've got. And Gay says, absolutely agree with development. It's paramount. Has no outcome. Yeah, thanks, Gay. Yeah, look, at the end of the day, it's about developing people. You know, if you asked a good leader what do they see as one of their core responsibilities, I'll guarantee they'll say something along the lines of getting the best out of people or developing people. So a good leader understands this intuitively, but all leaders have got to get to that point, because at the end of the day, that's what we're working with. Of course, we've got to get the product out the door, the service out the door, but at the end of the day, in order to keep improving and developing, we've got to actually work at will do the work for us. So thanks, Gay, for the comment. That's absolutely. If someone's making the comment about the sound, I apologize about that. There was nothing I can necessarily do about that. I guess it's one of the perils of what we do in the workplace. Someone said, I hope you're feeling better. Yeah, thanks, Chris. I didn't think I would continue there for a while, so obviously, you know, it's not the best time, is it, to get something in your... someone says, like the framework, one of the priorities is linked to performance to reward outside the competition. How do you give individual confidence that the reward is fairly calibrated? Yeah, look, that's a really... I often think that the remuneration conversation is a sixth conversation, or whatever. It's a separate conversation. So I think that what happens is the 5 conversation framework guides and informs the remuneration conversation, but it's certainly not directly linked. Because if you make a direct link with that, then you're not going to get people to talk openly and honestly about things. And I want that. That's what we're trying to create, a more authentic workplace. But nevertheless, you've got to have a remuneration conversation. I completely accept that. How do you ensure that it's fair? I think it's just done through conversation and discussion. You know, people will often think it's not fair no matter what. But look, if there's a good conversation, a good robust conversation going on, then that's the best it can get to. I mean, just because there's a number there doesn't mean it's going to make it any fairer. So I think we've got to actually instill confidence in our leaders that they can feel comfortable having these conversations with people because they're important. And it's up to the individual person, that's the team member, to mount a good case for why they deserve a pay rise. It's not all about the manager. And I often would find, I've often had this with people when I'm talking to them and say, well, you demonstrate to me why you think you're worth more, and I'll consider that. So it's up to the individual also to put the case. So I think it's a two-way process. It is a conversation. It's just a separate conversation. And I know the American system, it's much more likely that the performance review and the remuneration go hand in hand. I'm not necessarily an advocate of that. I don't think it's a good idea. But look, it should be separate. It should be a separate conversation. And all these other conversations should guide and inform that discussion. Someone says here, I agree competitive ratings don't work versus others. What about achievement orientation, me versus expectations? Brilliant. Thank you for that observation. I can see some value in having scores if we are scoring against criteria. Yes, I can see some value in that. But let's be honest, most of us are trying to create this kind of bell curve mentality in our workplaces where we have our top 10, our bottom 10, and everybody in the middle. And that's what we're doing, whether we're doing it consciously or subconsciously. We're actually trying to create that. And to me, I don't really see how that works. I mean, we all know who the top 10 are. We all know who the bottom 10 are. We don't need a magic wand, and we don't need a performance review to determine that. The question is, what are we doing about it, more than how do we rank people along the bell curve? So totally agree with you about that. I can see that, yeah. And again, when we talk about expectations, I don't think leaders are really very clear about articulating their expectations to their particular employees or their team members. They might think that they're clear about it, but often when you ask direct reports, what's your manager's expectation of the work that you do, it's often quite different to what the manager's expectation is of that work. So again, it's a conversation around expectations that's critically important. But if expectations are clear, if expectations are accepted, and if expectations are committed to, that's a really good place to be. But that requires more communication, and it requires a conversation and not making assumptions around what people are good at and not good at. Or, do people understand where the crossbar is? It becomes quite important. So that looks like all the questions that we've got there. So thank you very much for those questions. There were some very thought-provoking questions there. I'm more than happy to accept other questions online, so just shoot me an email if you'd like to talk further. And as I said before, if you're interested in looking at the online system, I'm happy to do that for you using this kind of process. And don't forget the 20% discount on the books, or you might be interested in the in-house one-day workshop for your managers on conversations at work. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your patience if we've had sound issues and my fits, but I've got through it. just, and I'll be going to have another big glass of water shortly and maybe a Panadol. But thank you very much, and I wish you all the very best in terms of the work that you do in organisations, because you do great work. It's important that you continue to grow and learn and do what you do. So thanks, guys. I appreciate it. It should be working.